The stagecoach groaned, its wheels spitting red dust as it shuddered to a halt. For a moment, Nora Calhoun remained perfectly still, her gloved hands clutching a worn leather satchel on her lap. Outside the window, the town of Clearwater, Montana, did not look like the start of a new life. It looked like the end of the road. A single, wide street was lined with squat, false front buildings that leaned against each other as if for support against the relentless wind. The wind was the first thing she had noticed, a cold, sharp presence that sliced down from the black pine forests covering the mountains that loomed over the settlement. It carried the scent of pine and something else, something wild and untamed that made the hair on her arms stand up. Taking a deep breath, Nora pushed open the flimsy door and stepped down. Her boots sank into the fine, rust-colored dust. She smoothed the front of her dark wool traveling dress, a garment more suited for the settled streets of Ohio than this raw-edged frontier. Every eye, it seemed, was on her. A woman shaking a rug from an upstairs window paused, her hands still. Two men leaning against a hitching post stopped their whittling to stare. Nora felt their gazes like a physical weight, measuring her, cataloging her, and finding her wanting. She was an outsider, a piece of flotsam washed up on their shore. Her instructions, written in her uncle's precise, spidery hand, were clear. She was to go to the general store and ask for Mr. Harlan Tate. The letter in her satchel, the one that sealed her fate, was addressed to him. She clutched the bag tighter and walked toward the largest building, its sign proclaiming Clearwater Mercantile in faded paint. The bell above the door jangled a discordant welcome. The interior smelled of coffee beans, cured leather, and dust. A pot-bellied stove in the center of the room radiated a meager warmth. Behind a long wooden counter, a balding man with a fringe of gray hair looked up from a ledger, his spectacles perched on the end of his nose. "Help you, miss?" he asked, his voice flat. "I am here to see Mr. Harlan Tate," Nora said, her own voice sounding small and foreign in the quiet room. "I was told he would be expecting me." The storekeeper, whose name she would later learn was Silas Croft, took off his spectacles and polished them with a corner of his apron. He took his time, his movements slow and deliberate. "Harlan Tate, you say?" It was not a question. "Yes, I have a letter for him." Silas Croft sighed, a weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of a long winter. "Well, miss, I am afraid you have had a long journey for nothing. We buried Harlan Tate 2 weeks ago. Thrown from his horse up on the ridge. Broke his neck." The words did not register at first. They were just sounds, empty of meaning. Nora stared at him, waiting for him to say more, to say he was mistaken. But his expression was one of pity, a look she had grown to hate. It was the same look the neighbors gave her after her parents had succumbed to fever 2 years prior, the look that said she was an unfortunate burden. "Dead," she whispered, the contents of her stomach turning to ice, her entire future. The fragile plan her uncle had constructed to save her from a life of dependent spinsterhood had been built upon this man, Harlan Tate, and he was gone. A woman who had been examining a bolt of calico near the back of the store spoke up. "The poor dear, come all this way. What will she do now?" Her voice was laced with a morbid curiosity that pricked at Nora's frayed nerves. Nora felt the room begin to tilt. She reached out a hand to steady herself against the counter. She had nowhere to go. Her uncle had sold her parents' house to pay for her passage west. There was no going back. She was adrift, a ship without a rudder or a port. "You have people?" Silas asked, his tone a little softer now. "Family nearby?" Nora shook her head, unable to speak past the lump forming in her throat. "Well then," a man's voice slurred from the doorway, "sounds like the little lady needs a place to stay." A man swaggered in, bringing a gust of cold air and the sour smell of whiskey with him. He was grimy, with a mean set to his mouth and small, close-set eyes that roved over Nora's form with an unnerving familiarity. "I got a place?" he said, grinning to reveal a row of stained teeth. "Plenty of room for a pretty thing like you." He took a step closer, and Nora instinctively recoiled, pressing herself back against the counter. The other people in the store watched, silent and unmoving. No one stepped forward. No one spoke a word in her defense. In their eyes, she was already fallen, a mail-order bride with no groom, fair game for any man who wanted her. "That is not necessary," Nora managed to say, her voice trembling. "I will be fine." "Now, do not be shy," the man wheezed, reaching a grimy hand toward her arm. Before his fingers could touch her, a shadow fell over them. The room had suddenly grown darker. Nora looked up to see a man standing just inside the door. A man so large he seemed to block out the light. He had not been there a moment before. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in buckskins and worn leather. A thick, dark beard covered the lower half of his face, and his hair was long and unruly. He said nothing. He did not have to. He simply looked at the drunk, his eyes a startlingly clear gray, as cold and hard as river stones. The drunken man's grin faltered. He seemed to shrink under that silent gaze. He took a half-step back, his bravado evaporating like mist in the sun. "Just being friendly," he mumbled, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. He glanced around the store, but found no support. He backed away, turned, and scurried out the door like a rat flushed from a barn. The large man watched him go, his expression unchanging. Then, his gray eyes moved to Nora. She expected to see judgment, or perhaps the same predatory interest as the other man. Instead, she saw nothing but a quiet, assessing stillness. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, then turned his attention to Silas Croft at the counter. "Need flour, salt, and coffee." "Silas," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. It was a voice unused to conversation, each word seeming to cost him some effort. Silas, who had been watching the exchange with wide eyes, hurried to fill the order. The tension in the room slowly began to dissipate. The woman with the calico went back to her shopping. The moment of drama was over. But for Nora, everything had changed. The ground had crumbled beneath her feet, and the only thing that had stood between her and a terrible fate was this silent, formidable stranger. He gathered his supplies, paid in coin, and turned to leave. He paused at the door and looked at Nora one last time. "You have a place to go?" he asked. The words clipped. She shook her head, shame and fear warring within her. He seemed to consider this for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the mountains visible through the grimy window. "I have a cabin," he said finally. "It is temporary, until you can make other arrangements." The offer hung in the air, as stark and unexpected as his appearance. The storekeeper stopped his work. The woman with the calico turned to stare openly. Go with this man, this wild man of the mountains. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at her to refuse. He was a stranger, a giant who looked as if he had been carved from the very rock and timber of the wilderness. But what was her alternative? To stay in this town where the women whispered behind their hands and the men looked at her like a piece of meat, to beg for charity. Her pride, the last thing she had left, would not allow it. She looked into his eyes, searching for a sign of ill intent. She found none. There was no guile in that steady gaze, only a straightforward solemnity. He was not offering comfort or kindness. He was offering shelter, a practical solution to a practical problem. "Thank you," she heard herself say. "I accept." A low murmur went through the store. Silas Croft looked disapproving. The woman gasped softly, but Nora lifted her chin and met their stares. Their opinions no longer mattered. They had offered her nothing but scorn and suspicion. This man, this stranger, had offered her a roof. His name, she learned as they walked out of the town and toward the steep foothills, was Logan McGray. He did not offer the information freely. She had to ask. He walked ahead of her, his long strides eating up the ground, forcing her to nearly run to keep up. He carried her satchel as if it weighed nothing. The path that led up Briar Ridge was not a road, but a faint track that wound its way through rock and pine. It was a grueling climb. Loose stones shifted under her feet, and the thin air burned in her lungs. They crossed a chasm on a bridge made of 2 logs and a few rickety planks, the wood groaning under their weight, a stream of melted snow. So cold it was painful, rushed through the gorge far below. Later, they had to ford a shallow but swift-moving creek, and the icy water soaked her boots and the hem of her dress, chilling her to the bone. Logan moved through it all with an easy, silent grace, as much a part of this harsh landscape as the trees and the rocks. He never offered a hand, but he would pause at the most difficult parts, waiting patiently for her to find her footing, his presence a silent assurance that he would not leave her behind. They reached the cabin just as the sun was setting, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple. It was a small, solid structure of hewn logs, tucked into a grove of aspen trees. A thin curl of smoke rose from a stone chimney. It was utterly isolated, a tiny outpost of humanity in a vast, indifferent wilderness. Inside, it was sparse but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. There was a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, and a bed built into one corner with a thick fur pelt for a blanket. Against the far wall was another sleeping platform, little more than a pile of clean straw with a few wool blankets. He gestured toward it. "You can sleep there." He said little more that evening. He moved about the small space with an efficient quiet, stoking the fire, preparing a simple meal of salt pork and beans, which they ate in silence. The silence was not awkward, but it was heavy, filled with the unspoken questions that lay between them. Nora was exhausted, her body aching from the journey, her mind numb with the shock of the day's events. She lay down on the straw bed, pulling the coarse wool blankets up to her chin. The fire cast flickering shadows on the log walls. Logan sat in a chair by the hearth, cleaning a long rifle. His movements methodical and precise. The warmth from the fire made her drowsy, but sleep would not come. Then she heard it, a long, mournful howl that rose and fell on the wind. It was answered by another, closer this time, wolves. Her blood ran cold. She sat bolt upright, her heart hammering against her ribs. The sound was primal, a reminder of just how far she was from anything she had ever known, and how vulnerable she truly was. Logan did not seem startled. He finished his work on the rifle and set it aside. Then he picked it up again, walked over to the door, and sat on a small stool just a few feet from where she lay. He did not look at her. He simply sat, his back to the wall, and laid the rifle across his lap, the barrel pointing toward the door. He must have sensed her fear, for he spoke into the firelit darkness, his voice a low, steady rumble. "My gun always points out," he said, his gaze fixed on the heavy wooden door. "Never in—" The words were simple, a plain statement of fact, but to Nora, they were a profound promise. He was not just a protector. He was a man of principle. The gun in his hands was a tool to keep the dangers of the world at bay, not to create new ones within the walls of his home. In that moment, a tiny, fragile seed of trust took root in the barren soil of her fear. The howling outside continued, but it seemed more distant now, its power to terrify lessened by the quiet, solid presence of the man sitting guard in the dark. Nora lay back down, her body still tense, but the frantic panic in her chest had subsided. She listened to the crackle of the fire and the sound of Logan's steady, even breathing. She would not run. There was nowhere to run to. For the first time that day, a thought, tentative and wild, flickered in her mind. This place, this harsh and lonely mountain, could be a sanctuary, it could be a home, if only she dared to trust. The sun rose cold and clear. its pale light filtering through the single, greased paper window of the cabin. Nora was already awake. She had been for some time, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the mountain morning, the sharp cry of a jay, the rustle of some small creature in the dry leaves outside, the steady, deep breathing of the man across the room. She watched the slow rise and fall of his shoulders under a worn wool blanket. In the daylight, he seemed less a myth and more a man, albeit one of massive proportions. A profound sense of dislocation washed over her. She was in a stranger's cabin, miles from a town that had already judged and dismissed her, with no money and no prospects. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to overwhelm her. But then she remembered the rifle laid across his lap. A silent sentinel in the night. My gun always points out, never in... The memory was an anchor. Instead of succumbing to fear, she rose. Action was the only antidote to despair. She moved quietly, her bare feet making little sound on the smooth, packed earth floor. The cabin was Logan's space, functional and devoid of any softness. The kitchen area consisted of a dry sink, a few iron pots hanging from hooks, and a small pantry cupboard. She opened it to find the supplies he had bought the day before: flour, salt, coffee, alongside sacks of beans and dried corn. It was the larder of a man who lived on sustenance, not comfort. She decided to make coffee. It was a simple, ordinary act, and ordinariness was what she craved. She found the grinder, and the rasping sound of the beans being crushed filled the small cabin. It was a domestic sound, a sound of purpose. By the time Logan stirred and sat up, the rich, dark aroma of coffee was mingling with the scent of wood smoke from the banked embers in the hearth. He said nothing, but his gray eyes followed her as she poured the steaming liquid into 2 tin mugs. She placed one on the small crate that served as his bedside table. He gave a short, single nod of acknowledgement. The gesture, small as it was, felt like a conversation. And so their days began to take on a rhythm, a silent dance of shared space and solitary tasks. Nora took over the cooking, transforming the simple ingredients into savory stews and cornbread baked in a Dutch oven over the fire. She found a sewing kit in her satchel and set about mending Logan's clothes. A shirt was torn at the elbow, a pair of buckskin trousers frayed at the knee. Her fingers, accustomed to fine needlework, were clumsy at first with the thick, tough materials. But she persisted. As she worked, she felt as if she were stitching together the frayed edges of her own life, creating small pockets of order in the vast uncertainty. Logan never commented on the changes. He would eat the meals she prepared without a word of praise. Yet he always cleaned his plate. He would put on a mended shirt, and the patch would be neat and strong, a silent testament to her care. His responses were not in words, but in actions. One morning, she awoke to find a sturdy, 3-legged stool next to her straw mattress. Its surface sanded smooth. She had been sitting on the hard floor to do her sewing, and he had noticed. Another morning, after a particularly cold night, a basin of steaming water sat waiting for her by the fire. He had risen before dawn to heat it for her. These small, unspoken kindnesses were like stones dropped into a deep well, the ripples spreading far beyond the initial gesture. They built a fragile bridge of communication between them, one made of observation and quiet consideration rather than words. One evening, as a cold rain drummed against the roof, Nora found the courage to speak of the past. She was kneading dough for the next day's bread, her hands covered in flour. "My father was a judge," she said, her voice soft. The words seemed loud in the quiet cabin. Logan looked up from the knife he was sharpening. "Back in Ohio. He was a good man, an honest man, but honesty makes enemies." She told him about the feud, a bitter, long-standing conflict with another family over a land dispute that her father had adjudicated. The other family, the Coulters, were powerful and vengeful. After her father's death, they had turned their malice toward her. Her uncle, a timid man who feared confrontation, had seen the arranged marriage to Harlan Tate as a solution, a way to send her far away, out of the Coulter's reach. Harlan Tate, Logan said. The name a flat, hard sound. He was no good, a braggart and a fool. But his family, they are not the Coulters. They are just as mean, though. I know, Nora whispered. My uncle did not understand. He just heard the name Tate and he thought it was a way to hide me in plain sight. To send me to a family he thought would be my enemy's enemies. She gave a short, bitter laugh. He sent me from one fire into another. Logan set his whetstone down. He looked at her, his gaze direct and searching. Your father made enemies by being honest. He said, that is a heavy price. The simple acknowledgement of her father's character, the understanding of his burden, unsealed something within her. It was a relief so profound it almost made her weep. No one had ever understood. They had only seen the trouble, the inconvenience she represented. And you, she asked, her voice barely audible. You live up here, alone. Did you have enemies too? His face, usually so impassive, shuddered. He stared into the fire, his jaw tight. The silence stretched, and Nora was sure he would not answer. She had overstepped. I was a soldier, he said at last, his voice rough. At the forts along the Laramie Trail. He picked up a small piece of wood from the kindling box and began to turn it over in his large hands. I had a wife, a daughter. He spoke the words as if they were foreign, objects he had not touched in a very long time. We had a small homestead, not far from the fort. I thought it was safe. He did not need to say more. The story was etched in the lines around his eyes, in the permanent winter of his expression. A raid, an attack, the kind of brutal, sudden violence that was a constant, whispered threat on the frontier. He had lost everything. He was a man hollowed out by grief, who had retreated from the world that had taken so much from him. They sat in silence, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the drumming of the rain. Two pasts, steeped in shadow and loss, now lay exposed in the small, warm circle of firelight. They were no longer just a man and a woman thrown together by circumstance. They were fellow survivors, each bearing scars the other could not see, but could now begin to understand. Their quiet life was shattered 2 weeks later. A rider from Clearwater, a lanky youth named Tom, made the difficult journey up the mountain trail. He carried a letter. It was addressed to Miss Nora Calhoun. The envelope was thick, the handwriting an elegant, sloping script. Nora took it with a sense of dread. The letter was from the Clearwater Women's Society for Moral Improvement. The name itself felt like a judgment. Her hands trembled as she read it aloud. The language was pious and condescending. It spoke of her unfortunate and irregular living situation and the shadow it cast upon the good name of the town. It stated that, for the sake of her soul and her reputation, she was required to come down to Clearwater and reside for a period of 6 days under the guidance and supervision of the Society's president, Mrs. Beatrice Hemlock. There, she would receive instruction in propriety and Christian virtue. The letter ended with a thinly veiled threat if she failed to comply. The Society would be forced to conclude that she was a woman of low character and would take steps to inform the wider community of her fallen state. They would make her a pariah. The paper shook in Nora's hand. The blood drained from her face, replaced by a hot, sick shame. They were calling her a harlot, dressing the insult in the language of righteousness. After all she had endured, all she had lost, this was what it had come to be judged and found wanting by a group of women who knew nothing of her life, nothing of her grief. Logan, who had been listening with a thunderous expression, took the letter from her. He read it himself, his jaw clenching so tightly a muscle jumped. He crumpled the paper into a tight ball and threw it into the fire. It flared brightly for a moment, then turned to black ash. You will not go, he stated. It was not a suggestion. It was a command. And do what Nora cried, her voice cracking. Stay here forever. Hide from them. They will ruin me. Logan, they will spread lies. I will never be able to hold my head up again. Not here, not anywhere. The old impulse to flee, to run from shame and judgment, rose up in her. But where could she go? She was trapped. The next day, she found a small, cloth-wrapped parcel at the bottom of her satchel. She had forgotten it was there. Inside were a few dozen flower seeds, zinnia and marigold. Saved by her mother from their garden in Ohio, they seemed like relics from another life, impossibly delicate and full of a promise that felt like a mockery in this harsh, rocky land. On an impulse born of defiance, she took an old, empty tin can from the rubbish pile. She filled it with dirt from the aspen grove, her fingers digging into the cold, damp earth. Carefully, she pushed the tiny seeds into the soil, one by one. She placed the can on the sill of the cabin's single window, where it would catch the morning sun. It was a small, foolish gesture, a prayer in a tin can. It was an act of faith in a future she could not see, a refusal to believe that this barren mountain was all that was left for her. It was a declaration that something beautiful could still grow, even here, even now. Logan watched her from the doorway, his expression unreadable. He did not mock her small, hopeful project. He simply watched, and in his silence, she felt a kind of acceptance. The letter lay between them like a coiled snake. For days, they barely spoke of it, but its poison tainted the air. The deadline, the end of the 6 days they had given her, loomed. Nora felt the weight of it with every passing hour. To go was to submit to their judgment, to admit that she had done something wrong. To stay was to become an outcast, to have her name and her honor destroyed. On the evening of the 5th day, she stood by the window, looking at the tin can. The sun was setting, and the sky was a riot of color over the dark. Silent peaks. She had been running her whole life, running from the Coulters, running from poverty, running from the pity in her uncle's eyes. She had come to the end of the continent only to find that she was still running. "I'm tired of hiding," she said to the reflection in the window. Logan was sitting at the table, cleaning his rifle, the same as he had on that first night. He stopped, his hands still. "They want to shame me," she said, turning to face him. "They want me to feel dirty, to feel worthless. And if I hide up here, I am letting them win. I am agreeing with them." He looked at her, his gray eyes steady. He did not tell her what to do. He waited for her to choose, and in that quiet, respectful waiting, he gave her back a piece of the strength she thought she had lost forever. She took a deep breath. The decision settled over her, calm and certain. "I will go down there. I will face them." She looked directly at him, her gaze unwavering. "But I will not go alone." A long moment passed. He set the rifle down on the table with a soft, final thud. He stood up, and for the first time, he seemed to fill the cabin not with his sighs, but with his resolve. "No more running," he said. His voice was a quiet vow. "We will go together." The walk down from Briar Ridge was a descent into a different world. Up in the thin, clean air of the mountain, the world was made of rock and pine, of the honest struggle for warmth and food. Down here, as they approached Clearwater, the world was made of eyes. They felt the stairs before they even reached the main street, a prickling on the back of the neck, a sense of being watched from behind curtained windows. Nora wore her best dress, the same dark wool she had arrived in, now cleaned and pressed as best she could manage over a fire. She had braided her hair so tightly it pulled at her scalp, a kind of physical armor. Beside her, Logan was an immovable mountain. He had not changed his buckskins or his quiet demeanor, but his presence was a statement. He was not hiding her. He was walking with her, in the full light of day, to face the town that had condemned them both without a trial. The town hall was a plain, box-like structure, the largest building in Clearwater besides the Mercantile. It served as a church on Sundays, a courtroom when the circuit judge passed through, and a meeting place for all public business. Today, it was a tribunal. As they stepped inside, a wave of cold, stale air washed over them. The room was filled with wooden pews, all facing a raised platform at the front, and every pew was occupied. It seemed the entire population of Clearwater had turned out for the spectacle. The Women's Society for Moral Improvement sat in the front 2 rows, a phalanx of stern expressions and tightly pinned bonnets. At their center, on the platform, sat a woman with a face so pinched it looked as if she were perpetually tasting something sour. This, Nora knew, must be Mrs. Beatrice Hemlock. A hush fell over the room as Logan and Nora entered. Every head turned. Whispers rustled through the crowd like dry leaves skittering across a frozen pond. Logan ignored them, his gaze fixed straight ahead. He led Nora not to the back, but to a pew near the front, just behind the society members. They sat, and the silence that followed was heavy and expectant. Mrs. Hemlock cleared her throat, a sound like a pebble dropping onto a tin roof. "We are gathered here," she began, her voice high and reedy, "to address a matter of grave concern to the moral fabric of our community. A young woman, Miss Nora Calhoun, arrived in our midst under circumstances both tragic and irregular." She paused, letting her words sink in, her eyes sweeping over the crowd before landing on Nora. Without family, without a protector, and without means, she has chosen to accept shelter in a most unconventional arrangement, an arrangement that has, quite rightly, become the subject of considerable talk. Nora felt her cheeks burn. She kept her eyes fixed on her hands, which were clasped so tightly in her lap her knuckles were white. She could feel Logan's stillness beside her, a solid, reassuring weight. "The society, Mrs. Hemlock continued, puffing out her chest, in its Christian charity, extended an offer of guidance, an opportunity for Miss Calhoun to rectify her situation and live under a respectable roof, to learn the ways of propriety. That offer was disregarded." The word hung in the air. An indictment, disregarded, as if their judgment was law, and her choice a crime. "Therefore, Mrs. Hemlock said, her voice rising, we must ask Miss Calhoun to account for her choices, to stand before this community and explain why she has chosen a path of impropriety." All eyes were on Nora. This was it, the moment of her humiliation. She could feel the collective weight of their judgment pressing down on her, trying to crush her. She took a shaky breath, preparing to stand, to say something, though she had no idea what words would come. Before she could rise, another woman shot to her feet. It was Martha Gable, a notorious town gossip whose tongue was said to be sharper than a skinning knife. Her face was flushed with righteous indignation. "Let us speak plainly. Beatrice!" she screeched, pointing a bony finger directly at Nora. The room, which had been merely quiet, became absolutely still. We all know the truth of it. At 19, she was sent here, still pure, to that giant mountain man after her intended died. Martha Gable paused for dramatic effect, her eyes wide. What he did next made everyone stunned. He took her up to that cabin, alone, for weeks. What explanation is needed for that? A shocked gasp went through the room, followed by a wave of excited, scandalized murmurs. The accusation, so crudely and publicly thrown, was uglier than anything Nora had imagined. Still pure. The words were meant to highlight her supposed fall from grace, to paint a lurid picture of her virtue being compromised. She felt faint, the edges of her vision going dark. The room seemed to be spinning. Then, a floorboard creaked. Logan stood up. He did not move quickly. He rose to his full, imposing height, and the murmuring died as if a door had been slammed shut. He turned, not to face Mrs. Hemlock on her platform, but to face the assembly, to face the entire town. His gray eyes, as calm and cold as a winter sky, moved over the crowd. and every person he looked at seemed to shrink back in their seat. Even Martha Gable, so bold a moment before, sank back into her pew, her mouth hanging slightly open. He did not look at Nora. He did not need to. His entire being was a shield, standing between her and the venom of the crowd. He took one step into the aisle, his boots making a heavy, solid sound on the wooden floor. When he spoke, his voice was not loud, but it filled the cold hall, reaching every corner. "There is no legal bond between us," he said, the words clear and deliberate, "but my conscience accepts the charge of her well-being. I have offered her shelter. I will continue to do so. Her safety and her honor are in my keeping." Silence. A profound, stunned silence. The town had expected a denial, a shouting match, perhaps the man to abandon the girl to her fate. They had not expected this quiet, unshakable declaration of responsibility. He was not excusing. He was not explaining. He was simply stating a fact, as solid and undeniable as the mountains outside. From a few rows back, a man's gruff voice was heard in the stillness. It was Jedediah, the town blacksmith, a man whose arms were as thick as tree limbs. "Well, I will be," he muttered to his neighbor, just loud enough to be heard. "The mountain man speaks." Next to him, Agnes, the baker's wife, a woman with kind eyes and flour permanently dusted on her apron, stood on her tiptoes to whisper to her husband. "He says little," she breathed, a small smile on her face, "but it hits the mark." The spell was broken. The solid wall of condemnation had cracked. Mrs. Hemlock, on the platform, looked apoplectic. Her face was a mask of fury. She had lost control of the proceedings, her authority usurped by a man who had spoken fewer than 50 words. Logan turned his head slightly and looked at Nora. It was a look of quiet command. "Stand." She understood, drawing on a reservoir of strength she did not know she possessed. Nora rose to her feet. She did not look at the floor. She did not look at her hands. She stood tall, her back straight, and met the curious, confused, and angry stares of the townspeople. She stood beside Logan, not behind him. They were two solitary figures, a united front against the judgment of the world. A few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. A man coughed. The certainty of their collective righteousness had been shaken. Some of the women from the society looked at Nora with a new, grudging respect. Others, like Mrs. Hemlock and Martha Gable, glared with an even deeper resentment. They had not been swayed by decency. They had been thwarted, and it made them furious. Logan gave a slight nod toward the door. Without another word, they turned and walked down the central aisle. The crowd parted for them as if the Red Sea. No one spoke. No one tried to stop them. They walked through the heavy silence, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the cavernous room. They stepped out into the cold, bright sunlight, leaving the chill of the meeting hall behind them. The air had never felt so fresh, so clean. They had faced the town, and they had not broken. But as they walked toward the edge of town, their backs to the meeting hall, a figure detached himself from the shadows of the alleyway between the saloon and the land office. He was a lean, wiry man with a face soured by resentment. His eyes, small and dark, were fixed on Nora's back with a cold, unnerving intensity. It was Marcus Tate. His brother, Harlan, was the fool who had gotten himself killed. But his other brother, Elias, had been a different matter entirely. Elias had been hanged 2 years back by the order of a traveling judge from Ohio, a judge named Calhoun. Marcus had heard the whispers, had followed the trail of the mail-order bride. He had watched from a distance when she arrived, had waited and listened. Now, he had seen it all. The girl had found herself a new protector, a big one. Marcus Tate smiled, a slow, unpleasant twisting of his lips. The town could have their moral debates. He was not interested in her honor. He was interested in justice, his family's kind of justice. The storm of gossip and judgment had passed, for now. But a far more dangerous storm was gathering, and it was following them up the trail to Briar Ridge. The climb back to the cabin was a silent one, the tension from the town hall clinging to them like the mountain chill. They had won a victory of sorts, but it was a hollow one. They had not changed any minds, merely silenced them for a time. The quiet of the high forest, which had once felt peaceful to Nora, now seemed watchful, filled with an unspoken threat. The wind whispering through the pines sounded like a rumor. They spent the next few days in a state of heightened awareness. Logan was gone for long stretches, not hunting but circling their small domain, his eyes scanning the forest floor for any sign of disturbance. He returned each time with nothing to report, yet the grim set of his jaw did not soften. Nora found herself starting at every unfamiliar sound, the cry of a hawk, the fall of a pine cone, the groan of a tree limb in the wind. The fragile peace they had built had been shattered, and fear was its replacement. The cold deepened as the sun set on the third day. A hard, biting frost was settling over the land, turning the world to silver and black under a sliver of moon. Inside the cabin, a large fire blazed in the hearth, but its warmth could not seem to penetrate the chill that had settled deep in Nora's bones. She was mending a tear in one of her dresses, her stitches small and tight, a futile attempt to impose order on a world that felt as if it were unraveling. Logan sat across from her, cleaning his rifle for the third time that day, his movements deliberate and almost ritualistic. It was the unnatural silence that came first, the constant, low hum of the wilderness, the chirping of crickets and the rustle of night creatures, suddenly ceased. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Logan's head came up, his hands stilling on the rifle. His eyes, fixed on the door, were suddenly sharp and intensely focused. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a silent command for Nora to remain quiet. Then they heard it, the soft, deliberate crunch of a boot on frosty ground. It was not the sound of a passing animal. It was the sound of a man trying and failing to be silent. The footsteps came closer, circling the cabin once before stopping on the small, rough porch just outside the door. Nora's heart leaped into her throat. She held her breath, her needle frozen in the fabric. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Nora Calhoun, a voice called from the darkness. It was a raspy, unpleasant sound, laced with a false congeniality that made her skin crawl. "I know you are in there. I just want to talk." It was the voice of a predator trying to sound like a friend. Logan rose to his feet in a single, fluid motion. He was utterly silent. He gestured for Nora to move to the far corner of the cabin, away from the door and the single window. Then he walked to the hearth and picked up the heavy iron poker. He handed it to her, his eyes conveying the unspoken instruction. A weapon, just in case. He moved back to the center of the room, his rifle held loosely in one hand. He did not go to the door. Instead, he spoke to the man outside, his own voice a low, calm rumble that held no trace of fear. "She has nothing to say to you," Logan said. "State your business with me, or move on." There was a short, humorless laugh from outside. "My business is not with you, mountain man. It is with the girl. Her father did my family a great wrong. We have a debt to settle." Marcus Tate. The name was a confirmation of Nora's deepest fears. This was not about her living arrangement. This was about the old feud, a ghost that had followed her 2,000 miles to this remote mountain ledge. "This cabin is too small for a settlement," Logan said, his voice still unnervingly calm. He began to walk slowly toward the door. "If you want to talk about debts, we will talk outside, man to man." Nora understood his strategy in a flash of cold terror. He was drawing the threat away from her, away from the enclosed space of the cabin. He was luring Marcus Tate out into the open, into the darkness of the forest, an environment where Logan was the master. "You come out alone," Marcus Tate's voice rasped. "No tricks." "Just me," Logan said. He glanced at Nora, a silent communication passing between them. "Stay here. Stay hidden." Then he unlatched the heavy wooden bar from the door, pulled it open, and stepped out into the freezing night, closing it firmly behind him. Nora was plunged into a new kind of silence, the silence of absolute uncertainty. She crept to the wall, pressing her ear against the rough logs, but she could hear nothing but the frantic thumping of her own heart. The poker felt heavy and useless in her trembling hands. Minutes stretched into an eternity. She strained to hear a footstep, a voice, anything. There was only the wind. She imagined them out there, two shadows moving through the frozen trees. She pictured Logan, his quiet competence against the other man's malice. Then the night exploded. A single gunshot, shockingly loud, ripped through the silence. It was a flat, brutal crack that echoed off the mountainside and then was swallowed by the vast, empty darkness. Nora cried out, her hand flying to her mouth. She did not know who had fired. She did not know who had been hit. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the shot itself. She waited, frozen in place, her mind a whirlwind of horrific possibilities. After what felt like a lifetime, she heard a sound at the door, not the stealthy crunch of before, but a heavy, familiar footstep. The latch scraped, and the door swung open. Logan stood there, silhouetted against the pale moonlight. He was alone. He stepped inside and barred the door behind him, his movement stiff. "Are you hurt?" she whispered, her voice a reedy thread. "He is gone," Logan said, his voice strained. "For now." He took a step toward the firelight, and she saw it. A dark, wet stain was spreading across the shoulder of his buckskin shirt. His left arm hung limp at his side. "You are bleeding," she gasped, rushing forward. "It is a graze," he said, but his face was pale, and a fine sheen of sweat covered his brow. He sank heavily into one of the chairs by the table. He fired from the trees, did not see him until it was too late. Nora's fear was instantly replaced by a fierce, focused urgency. She tore a strip of clean cloth from a spare petticoat in her satchel. She fetched the basin of water and brought it to the table. Her hands were shaking, but her mind was surprisingly clear. "Take off your shirt," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. He winced as he shrugged the heavy garment off his wounded shoulder. The bullet had gouged a raw, bloody furrow through the thick muscle of his upper arm. It was not deep, but it was bleeding freely. Gently, she began to clean the wound. Her touch was hesitant at first, then grew more confident. She worked in silence, her entire being concentrated on the task. This was something she could do. She could mend this. As she cleaned away the blood, she saw something that made her stomach clench. Small bits of stone and dirt were embedded in the wound. "He was not alone," Logan said, his voice tight with pain as she worked. "I found 2 sets of tracks leading up to the cabin, and they were not wandering. They knew the trail. They knew the terrain." The implication was chilling. This was not a single impulsive act of revenge. It was planned. Marcus Tate had allies, men who knew this mountain. They were not just facing one man, they were facing a coordinated threat. Nora finished cleaning the wound as best she could, then took a fresh strip of cloth and began to bind it tightly, creating a pressure bandage to stop the bleeding. Her hands moved with a deftness she did not know she possessed. The shaking had stopped. In its place was a cold, hard resolve. As she tied the final knot, her head was bent low over his arm. She could feel the heat radiating from his skin, could smell the scent of pine and sweat and blood. He was so still, so quiet, letting her tend to him without a word of complaint. He was vulnerable, and in his vulnerability, she felt a surge of protectiveness so fierce it took her breath away. He looked down at her small hand so carefully wrapping his wound. His expression was one she had never seen before. The hard, stoic mask had fallen away, and what lay beneath was a raw, aching sorrow. "I have lost too much," he said, his voice so low she could barely hear it over the crackle of the fire. He reached out with his good hand and touched her cheek, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle. "You will not be one of them." The words were a confession, a promise, a cry from the heart of a man who had walled himself off from the world. He was not just protecting a stranger he had taken pity on. He was protecting the last flicker of light in his own dark life. Nora felt tears well in her eyes, blurring his face. She did not wipe them away. She simply met his gaze, and in the space of that long, silent look, the fragile bond between them was forged into something unbreakable. They sat in silence for a long time after that. The fire burned low, and the cabin grew colder, but neither of them noticed. The immediate danger had passed. But the larger threat now had a face and a name, and it had allies. Finally, Nora stood up and moved to the corner where Logan's rifle leaned against the wall. She looked at it, at the long, dark barrel and the smooth, worn stock. It was an object of death, a tool of violence, but it was also a tool of survival. She turned back to him. He was watching her, his expression weary but alert. "This is not over," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "They will be back. I will not be a burden. I will not be a victim for you to protect." She took a deep breath, the words tasting strange and new on her tongue. "Teach me how to use this. Teach me how to shoot." Logan looked from her determined face to the rifle and back again. He saw the fear in her eyes, but he also saw something else, a core of steel she had discovered within herself. She was no longer the frightened girl who had arrived in Clearwater. She was a woman who had chosen her ground and was ready to defend it. He gave a slow, solemn nod. "All right," he said. He pushed himself to his feet, his movements pained but resolute. "But you will learn my way. There is one rule, and you will never break it." He looked at her, his gray eyes deadly serious. "You only shoot when there is no other way out." The lessons began the next morning. The rifle was heavy, an awkward and menacing weight in Nora's arms. Logan's bandaged shoulder was a stark reminder of why this was necessary. He started not with shooting, but with respect for the weapon. He made her hold it, feel its balance, learn its parts. He showed her how to load it, his movements slow and precise, his one good arm doing the work of two. Then he had her practice aiming, her arms aching as she held the rifle steady, sighting down the long barrel at a knot on a distant pine tree until the world narrowed to that single point. In the afternoons, the air filled with a different sound, the sharp, rhythmic ring of an axe biting into wood. Logan had begun felling trees in a small clearing up the slope from the cabin. His shoulder was still healing, and Nora could see the lines of pain around his eyes as he swung the heavy axe. But he did not stop. When she tried to protest, to tell him he should rest, he simply shook his head. "Winter is coming," he said, his voice clipped, "and this cabin is too small." She understood then. He was not just gathering firewood. He was building. The word hung in the air between them, unspoken but immense. He was building a home, not just a temporary shelter, but a place meant to last, a fortress against the cold and the shadows that hunted them. The sound of his axe became the new rhythm of their days, a steady, defiant heartbeat on the silent mountain. The work consumed him. From dawn until dusk, he was hewing logs, stripping bark, notching the ends with a skill that was both brutal and precise. Nora became his partner. She could not lift the heavy logs, but she could clear brush, bring him water, and keep the fire going to heat their meals. She learned to anticipate his needs, having a tool ready before he asked for it, a mug of hot coffee waiting when he paused to rest. They worked in a comfortable silence, their shared purpose a bond stronger than words. One morning, she watched him measure a long, straight pine log for what must have been the third time. He knelt in the wood shavings, his brow furrowed in concentration as he ran a piece of charcoal tied to a string along its length. "You measured that 3 times," she said, a smile touching her lips. He looked up, his expression serious. He glanced from the log to the foundation of the new cabin, a larger rectangle of cleared earth next to their small one. "So when you look out the window," he said, his voice a low rumble, "nothing seems crooked." His words struck her with a physical force. He was not just building walls. He was building her a view. He was thinking of her, of how the world would look through her eyes from inside the home they were making. He had already decided where her window would go, a spot on the eastern wall where the first rays of morning sun would fall across the table she used for her sewing and reading. Life settled into this new pattern. Mornings were for lessons with the rifle, the sharp crack of a practice shot echoing in the clear, cold air. Afternoons were for building, the air thick with the clean, sharp scent of sawdust and fresh-cut pine. Evenings were for quiet companionship by the fire, the aroma of corn roasting in the embers mingling with the smell of gun oil. Nora felt a change in herself. The fear was still there, a cold stone in the pit of her stomach, but it was no longer her master. It was a companion she had learned to live with. Her hands, once soft and suited for embroidery, were now calloused and capable. She could load a rifle, cook a meal over an open fire, and tell by the sound of the axe whether the blade was sharp. She was becoming a creature of this mountain, as tough and resilient as the pines that clung to its rocky slopes. About a month after the incident at the town hall, their supplies began to run low. It was Logan who went down to Clearwater, his rifle resting in the crook of his arm, his expression unreadable. Nora waited, a knot of anxiety tightening in her chest with every hour he was gone. She sat on the porch of their half-built home, the silent wooden skeleton rising around her, and practiced aiming the spare rifle at imaginary targets in the trees. He returned just before dusk, leading the mule laden with sacks of flour and salt. He looked tired, but unharmed. He did not say much about his reception in town, but the contents of the pack spoke for him, alongside their usual supplies. There was a heavy canvas bag filled with nails. "Jedediah sent these," Logan said, his voice gruff as he untied the bag. "Said no man should build a house with wooden pegs if he does not have to." Nora stared at the nails, a small fortune on the frontier. The blacksmith, the man who had muttered, "The mountain man speaks." It was an offering, a gruff, unspoken message of support from an unlikely corner. A few days later, another offering arrived. Tom, the lanky delivery boy, made his way up the trail, looking nervous but determined. He carried a bulky, cloth-wrapped package. "From Mrs. Miller, ma'am," he said, handing the parcel to Nora and avoiding her eyes. "The baker's wife. She said she had extra flour and sugar." Inside, Nora found not just flour and sugar, but a small jar of yeast and a carefully wrapped loaf of fresh, soft bread. Still slightly warm, it was a taste of civilization, a taste of kindness. Agnes, the woman who had whispered, "It hits the mark." Nora's eyes welled with tears. The women of the society had tried to cast her out, but this woman, with her flour-dusted hands and warm heart, had reached out. The town was not a monolith. It was made of people, and some of them, it seemed, had chosen to see not a scandal, but 2 people trying to build a life against the odds. Even the sheriff made an appearance. He rode up one afternoon, a taciturn man with a thick mustache and watchful eyes. He did not dismount. He simply sat on his horse at the edge of the clearing, observing the new structure, the neat stacks of firewood, the quiet, purposeful way Nora and Logan moved around their homestead. He watched Nora take up the rifle and practice her aim, her movements steady and sure. He saw Logan, his shoulder now almost healed, lift a heavy log into place. After a long time, the sheriff touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was not quite a salute, but was no longer a sign of suspicion. It was a look of grudging respect. Then he turned his horse and rode away. The walls of the new cabin rose log by log. It was larger than the first, with 2 rooms and 2 windows, one of which faced the rising sun. The day Logan fitted the frame into that window was a quiet triumph. He ran his hand over the smooth, sanded wood. And then, when he thought she was not looking, he took out his knife. With a few quick, deft strokes, he carved a small, almost invisible letter N into the side of the frame, right where his hand would pass each time he opened or closed the shutter. It was a secret mark, a claim, a quiet declaration of whose home this truly was. As the first snows began to dust the highest peaks, the cabin was nearly finished. It had a solid roof of split cedar shakes and a wide stone hearth that drew the smoke cleanly. It felt like a palace. It felt safe. One evening, as they sat before the first fire in their new fireplace, Logan reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small wooden box, no bigger than the palm of his hand. It was made of aspen wood, polished to a pale, smooth sheen. He had carved it himself, the lid decorated with the delicate, intertwined shapes of pine needles. He held it out to her. Nora took it, her fingers tracing the intricate carving. She opened the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of soft moss, lay 2 rings. They were not made of gold or silver. They were carved from a single piece of dark, rich walnut wood, their surfaces polished until they shone. They were simple, beautiful, and perfect. Nora looked up at him, her heart so full she could not speak. His face, illuminated by the flickering firelight, was stripped of its usual hardness. In his eyes, she saw a deep, aching tenderness. "The circuit preacher is due in Clearwater in 2 weeks, he said, his voice a low, hesitant rumble. He could ride up here. He paused, searching for the right words. Words that did not come easily to him. "If you are still willing," he said, his voice barely a whisper. We could say the words. It was not a question of love, not in the flowery, poetic way she had read about in books. It was a question of choice, a question of willingness. After everything they had been through, the hardship, the judgment, the fear, was she willing to bind her life to his, to make this mountain, this man, her permanent home? Tears streamed down her cheeks, but they were tears of joy, of a profound and overwhelming sense of homecoming. She had been sent here, a piece of human cargo, destined for a man she had never met. She had been lost, alone, and terrified. Now, she was being asked. She was being given a choice. She reached out and took his large, calloused hand in both of her own. She brought it to her lips and kissed the rough knuckles. "I am willing," she said, her voice clear and strong. The preparations began the next day. There would be no white dress, no church full of guests. Their wedding would be like their life, simple, honest, and stripped down to what was essential. They would be married on the mountainside, in a small meadow dotted with late-blooming wildflowers that had somehow survived the first frosts. They cleared a small patch of ground, and Logan built a few rough-hewn benches for the few guests they would invite: Jedediah, the blacksmith, Agnes, the baker's wife, and perhaps even the silent, watchful sheriff. It would be a wedding with very few people, and a great deal of wind. Under the vast, open sky of the Montana frontier, it would be theirs. The day of the wedding arrived on the breath of a crisp autumn wind. It was a restless, energetic wind, the kind that swept the sky clean of clouds, leaving it a vast, aching blue. It carried the scent of pine and distant snow, and the dry, sweet smell of the wildflowers that dotted their chosen meadow. The meadow was a small, sheltered shelf on the mountainside, a patch of unlikely softness in the rugged landscape. The view from it was breathtaking, a panorama of forested ridges and deep, shadowed valleys that stretched all the way to the horizon. Their guests arrived not in carriages, but on foot and on horseback, making the slow, steady climb from Clearwater. There were only 4. Jedediah, the blacksmith, looked profoundly uncomfortable. his huge frame squeezed into a Sunday suit that was too tight in the shoulders. He carried a heavy, clumsily wrapped package, which he handed to Logan with a grunt. Agnes, the baker's wife, was beaming, her round face flushed with the effort of the climb. She presented Nora with a small, three-tiered cake, a miracle of sugar and flour, decorated with crystallized violets. The sheriff, whose name was Elias Thorne, came last, his presence as quiet and solid as the mountain itself. He gave them a single, solemn nod of acknowledgement. And then there was the preacher, a man named Reverend Michael, a circuit rider whose face was a roadmap of all the dusty trails and hard winters he had endured. He was thin and weathered, but his eyes were kind. Nora wore her dark wool dress, the one she had arrived in, the one she had been publicly shamed in. Today, she was reclaiming it. She had sewn a new collar of fine, white linen onto it, and Agnes had helped her weave a small crown of purple asters into her tightly braided hair. She held a small bouquet of the same wildflowers, their stems tied with a simple piece of twine. She was not a blushing bride from a storybook. She was a woman standing on the edge of the world, choosing her place in it. Logan wore a clean linen shirt, a rare concession to formality, but he still wore his buckskins and boots. He looked as much a part of the mountain as the granite outcroppings, a force of nature contained, for this one day, in the shape of a man. He watched Nora walk toward him across the meadow, the wind pressing her dress against her, and a look of profound awe softened the hard lines of his face. He was a man who had forgotten how to hope, and here, walking toward him, was a hope he had never dared to imagine. They stood before the preacher, with the wind as their witness and the vast, silent mountains as their cathedral. Their few guests stood in a small, loyal semicircle behind them. The Reverend Michael's voice, though not strong, carried on the wind, speaking of companionship in hardship, of building a home not just with logs and nails, but with faith and fortitude. When it came time for the vows, the preacher looked to Logan, but Logan did not speak. Instead, he did something that made Agnes gasp and Jedediah's jaw drop. He went down on one knee before Nora. He was a giant of a man, and the gesture of supplication was so unexpected, so powerful. It seemed to silence the very wind around them. He did not look at her face. He took her right hand, the one that was not holding the flowers. In both of his, he studied it, his thumb gently tracing the calluses on her palm and the small, faded scar on her knuckle where a needle had slipped. This was the hand he had seen kneading dough, mending his clothes, cleaning his wound, and holding a rifle with unwavering stillness. He lifted it to his lips and pressed a kiss to the back of her hand. A gesture of such reverence it felt more sacred than the preacher's prayer. He looked up at her then, his gray eyes shining with an emotion she had never seen in them before. "These are the strongest hands I have ever known," he whispered, his voice thick and rough, meant for her ears alone. Tears streamed freely down Nora's face, but she was smiling. In that moment, she was not the orphan, not the mail-order bride, not the subject of town gossip. She was a woman cherished for her strength, for the very scars the world had given her. She gently pulled her hand free and reached down to cup his bearded cheek. "Then rise, my husband," she said softly, "and stand beside me." He rose to his full height, and they turned back to the preacher, their hands now clasped together. Their vows were not the long, memorized verses from the prayer book. The Reverend Michael, with a wisdom born of his travels, simply asked them the essential questions. "Logan McGraw, do you take this woman, Nora Calhoun, to be your wedded wife, to live together in this holy estate, to love her, comfort her, honor and keep her, in sickness and in health, and, forsaking all others, keep you only unto her, so long as you both shall live?" Logan's gaze never left Nora's face. "I do," he said, his voice a clear, strong vow that the wind could not carry away. "Nora Calhoun, do you take this man, Logan McGray, to be your wedded husband, to live together in this holy estate, to love him, comfort him, honor and keep him, in sickness and in health, and, forsaking all others, keep you only unto him, so long as you both shall live." Her hand tightened in his. "I do," she said, her voice filled with a certainty that resonated deep in her soul. "Then by the authority vested in me by God and the territory of Montana," the preacher declared, his voice rising with joy, "I pronounce you man and wife." For a moment, they simply stood there, looking at each other, the world falling away. Then Logan's face broke into a slow, rare smile that transformed him completely. He leaned down and kissed her, not with passion, but with a deep, tender promise that sealed their vows more surely than any words. A smattering of applause broke the spell. It was not a loud ovation, but the hearty clapping of Jedediah's huge hands and the enthusiastic patting of Agnes's gloved ones. It sounded like a light, welcome shower of rain after a long drought. The sheriff even offered a small, gruff smile. The tension of the past month seemed to dissolve into the thin mountain air. Jedediah opened his gift, revealing a beautifully wrought iron fireplace set, each piece twisted into the shape of a pine branch. Agnes fussed over her cake, cutting generous slices for everyone. Laughter, a sound rarely heard on this part of the mountain, echoed in the meadow. Jedediah told a story about a stubborn mule, and even Logan contributed a quiet, dryly witty comment that made the sheriff chuckle. Someone, perhaps Agnes, hummed a tune, a simple waltz. Logan looked at Nora, a question in his eyes. She smiled and nodded. He took her hand, and they began to dance, there in the meadow, surrounded by wildflowers and their small circle of friends. It was a clumsy, awkward waltz. He was too big, his steps too heavy. She was unaccustomed to being led, her feet tangling with his. But they laughed, a shared, genuine joy that was more beautiful than any graceful ballroom display. They were two people who did not know the steps, finding their rhythm together, creating something new and uniquely their own. But they were not entirely alone. Farther up the slope, concealed within a dense thicket of pines at the edge of the tree line, a man lay on his belly. He was far enough away to be invisible, but close enough that the small figures in the meadow were perfectly clear through the brass spyglass he held to his eye. He had watched the entire ceremony. His lip curled in a sneer. He had seen the blacksmith and the baker's wife, had noted the presence of the sheriff. He watched the giant of a man kneel before the girl. He watched them kiss. Now, he watched them laugh and stumble through their ridiculous dance. Every peal of their laughter was an insult. Every moment of their happiness was a stone grinding in his gut. This was not how the story was supposed to end. The girl was supposed to be ruined, cast out, made to pay for the sins of her father. She was supposed to be his to break. Instead, she had found a protector. She had found friends. She had found a home. She had found joy. The man, Marcus Tate, slowly lowered his spyglass. His eyes, small and dark in his sallow face, were flat and cold. There was no joy in them. There was no laughter. There was only a patient, simmering hatred, a promise of a storm to come that would extinguish the small, bright flame of their wedding day. The eye in the thicket of pines was not smiling. The quiet weeks that followed the wedding were a gift, a pocket of impossible peace in a life that had known very little of it. The wind still blew, but now it was just the wind, not a carrier of whispers and threats. The mountain, once a place of exile, had become a sanctuary. They settled into the new cabin, its 2 rooms feeling as spacious as a mansion. The morning sun, just as Logan had promised, streamed through the east window, falling across the table where Nora kept her mending basket and the one book she owned. The small, carved N on the window frame was a constant, secret smile she shared with him. The first snows came, a light dusting that turned the world to silver. It was a beautiful, solemn warning. Winter was closing its hand around the mountain, They needed one last trip to Clearwater for the heavy supplies that would see them through until spring sacks of grain, barrels of salted meat, kerosene for the lamps. The morning Logan set out, the sky was a sheet of leaden gray. The air was unnaturally still and heavy, carrying a deep, penetrating cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. Nora watched him lead the mule down the trail until he was just a speck against the vast, somber landscape. "The sky looks angry," she had said, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. "I will be back before it breaks," he had promised, his hand briefly touching her cheek. But the sky did not wait. By midday, the stillness was broken by a low, mournful moan of wind that rose steadily to a piercing shriek. The first snowflakes began to fall, not the gentle, drifting flakes of before, but hard, tiny pellets that stung the skin. Within an hour, the world outside the window was a churning, blinding tempest of white. The trail to Clearwater would be impassable, a treacherous landscape of hidden rocks and sudden drifts. He was trapped out there, and he was not alone. She knew it with a certainty that was as cold as the wind itself. Panic, a familiar, unwelcome visitor, tried to claw its way up her throat. She fought it down with a deliberate, cold fury. She would not be a helpless victim waiting for her fate. She was Logan's wife, and this was her home. She moved with a sharp, focused energy. Her plan, a contingency born of long, watchful nights, clicked into place in her mind. First, she took the large storm lantern, filled it with oil, and lit the wick, adjusting it until it burned with a bright, steady flame. She placed it in the center of the east window, a beacon against the swirling chaos. It was a signal of hope for Logan, and a clear, defiant target for anyone else. Next, she took the empty tin cans she had been saving and a long ball of twine. Working quickly in the biting wind that tore at the porch, she strung a crude but effective alarm system, a web of tripwires and clattering cans that circled the entire cabin. Any approach would be announced. Finally, she went back inside, barred the heavy door, and took down the spare rifle. She loaded it with steady hands, the click of the cartridge seating in the chamber a small, satisfying sound against the roar of the storm. Then she sat in the chair that faced the door, the rifle across her lap, and waited. Logan felt the ambush before he saw it. The air grew thick with menace, a feeling separate from the storm. The trees, heavy with snow, seemed to press in on the narrow trail. He was leading the mule through a tight pass between two large rock formations when the first shot rang out. The sound swallowed almost immediately by the wind. A bullet tore through the sack of flour on the mule's back, exploding in a puff of white that was indistinguishable from the snow. The mule screamed and reared, its eyes wide with terror. Logan threw himself from the trail, rolling behind a snow-covered boulder as two more shots kicked up sprays of rock and ice where he had just been. He could see them now, 3 figures in heavy coats, dark shapes against the white, moving to flank him. Marcus Tate and 2 others. A straight fight was suicide. He was outnumbered, and the blizzard was their ally, masking their movements. He had only one advantage, he knew this mountain. Every rock, every tree, every treacherous ravine was mapped in his mind. He fired one shot back, not to hit, but to make them take cover. Then, leaving the panicked mule and the scattered supplies behind, he melted into the blinding storm, moving not down towards safety, but up, deeper into the mountain's embrace. He was leading them to a place he knew, a narrow, winding canyon of sheer rock walls where the wind was a living thing, a malevolent force that could tear a man from his feet. Back at the cabin, the hours crawled by. Nora did not move from her chair. The storm raged, rattling the shutters and piling snow against the walls. The world was a maelstrom of white noise and motion. Then, through the howl of the wind, she heard it, a faint, frantic clatter, a tin can, dancing on the end of its string. Someone was out there. She rose, her heart hammering. the rifle now a cold, familiar weight in her hands. She moved to the side of the door, pressing her back against the rough logs. The footsteps were heavy, clumsy in the deep snow. They reached the porch. A gloved hand fumbled at the latch. "Logan!" she called out, her voice tight. A moment of silence, then a harsh, scraping sound as a knife was wedged into the door jamb, trying to pry the bar loose. "He is not coming back." "Nora," the hateful, raspy voice of Marcus Tate sneered from the other side. "He is lying dead in the snow. It is just you and me now. We have a debt to settle." The knife splintered the wood, but the heavy bar held. There was a frustrated curse, followed by a heavy thud as he threw his shoulder against the door. It groaned, but did not give. Nora sighted the rifle on the center of the door, her finger resting on the trigger. She remembered Logan's one rule: only when there is no other way out. Then the assault on the door stopped. She heard his footsteps moving away, toward the side of the cabin, toward the window with the lantern. She realized his plan a second too late. There was a crash of shattering oiled paper and wood as the butt of his rifle smashed through the window frame. A blast of wind and snow filled the room, and the lantern toppled from its sill. Its flame extinguished, plunging the cabin into near darkness, lit only by the faint, dying glow of the fire. Before she could react, he was scrambling through the broken window. He was a lean, wiry shape, covered in snow, his face a mask of triumphant hatred. He raised his rifle, but in that split second of darkness and confusion, Nora did not cower. She spoke. "My father sent your brother to the gallows because he was a killer." "Marcus," she said, her voice shockingly calm and clear in the howling wind. "Is that the debt you are here to collect to prove him right?" Marcus froze, his rifle half raised. Her words, so unexpected, had thrown him off balance. "He disgraced my family," he spat, his voice shaking with rage. "Your father, with his high and mighty laws. He took everything from us." "He took a murderer from the world," Nora said. Her own rifle still held steady, though he could not see it clearly in the gloom. "What you call disgrace, he called justice. There is a difference. Or has your hatred blinded you to it?" "Justice," he sneered, taking a step toward her. "This is justice. An eye for an eye. Your life for my brother's." "That is not justice. Marcus, that is just pride," she said, her voice softening slightly, becoming almost pitying. "You are not here for your brother. You are here for yourself. You are here because you cannot stand the thought that your family was wrong. You would rather be a killer yourself than admit that." He stared at her, his mouth working but no words coming out. She had struck a nerve, peeled back the layers of his self-righteous fury and exposed the ugly, pathetic truth beneath. He was not an avenger. He was just a bitter, prideful man, clinging to a legacy of violence. His momentary hesitation was all it took. The cabin door, which he had left unguarded, burst open. A massive, snow-covered shape filled the doorway. It was Logan. He was not dead. His face was a grim mask of fury, his rifle leveled. But behind him, more shapes emerged from the swirling snow. The broad form of Jedediah the blacksmith, a huge axe in his hand, the tall, resolute figure of Sheriff Thorne, a pistol in his grip, two other townsmen, armed and ready. They had seen the light. The small, steady beacon had guided them through the storm. Marcus Tate's face crumpled. The hatred, the fury, the pride, all of it collapsed into a mask of pure, abject fear. He was trapped, his quest for vengeance ending not in a blaze of glory, but in a small, dark room, surrounded by the very community he despised. He dropped his rifle with a clatter. They found his two accomplices later, huddled in a shallow cave not far from the canyon Logan had led them to. One had a bullet in his leg, a clumsy, panicked shot from his partner in the blinding confusion of the storm. The other was half frozen, his hands and feet black with frostbite. They had been defeated not by Logan, but by the mountain itself. by their own greed and incompetence. They brought the three men back to the cabin, their hands bound. The storm was already beginning to break, the wind lessening its terrible howl. In the quiet aftermath, as the first pale light of dawn filtered through the broken window, a council was held. "They will hang for this," Jedediah growled, his voice a low rumble of satisfaction. "And good riddance." Sheriff Thorne nodded in agreement. "Frontier justice is swift." Nora looked at Logan. He was watching her, his eyes asking a silent question. This was their home, their sanctuary. These men had violated it, had tried to destroy everything they had built. By all the laws of this hard land, they had the right to exact their own justice. She thought of her father, of the law he had served. She thought of Marcus Tate's twisted, hateful face, an eye for an eye, and the whole world goes blind. She walked over to Sheriff Thorne. "No," she said, her voice clear and steady. "You will take them back to Clearwater. They will wait for the circuit judge. They will have a trial." The men stared at her, stunned. "This house," Logan said, his voice filling the quiet room, his hand coming to rest on Nora's shoulder. "This house was built on truth, not on bodies." The final decision was made. They would choose law, not vengeance. They would choose light, not the darkness that had pursued them for so long. Later, after the sheriff and his impromptu posse had departed, leading their prisoners down the now passable trail, Nora stood in the doorway of her home. The storm had passed. The world was blanketed in a pristine, silent layer of white. The air was clean and cold. She was shaking, a deep, bone-weary tremor of reaction. But she did not feel broken. She felt clean, purged. Her eyes fell on the broken storm lantern, lying on its side near the hearth. Its glass was shattered, its flame extinguished, but its light had been enough. The small, fragile light she had placed in the window had been strong enough to cut through the darkest storm and lead a whole town to their door. It had been enough to bring them home. The winter that followed was long and deep, a season of healing. The mountain wrapped them in a profound silence, a thick blanket of snow that muffled the outside world. Logan, with Jedediah's help, built a new, stronger frame for the east window. This time with a real glass pane that the blacksmith had ordered from Helena. It was a luxury, a small miracle of clarity. Nora would often stand before it, looking out at the pristine white world, feeling the weak winter sun on her face, and marvel at how a view once framed by fear was now a portrait of peace. News from the world below came in intermittent bursts, delivered by the sheriff or Jedediah on their occasional visits. The trial of Marcus Tate and his men had been the talk of the territory. The circuit judge, a stern but fair man, had listened intently to the testimony of Sheriff Thorne, of Logan, and of Nora herself. Her voice, clear and unwavering in the stuffy Clearwater courtroom, had reportedly held the assembly spellbound. She did not speak of vengeance or fear, but of law and the poison of old hatreds. Marcus Tate and his accomplices were not hanged. They were sentenced to 20 years of hard labor in the territorial prison. Jedediah, reporting the news, had shaken his head in grudging admiration. The judge said your way was the harder way, but the better one. Said it was time Montana started building something more permanent than graves. With the spring thaw, the world seemed to be reborn. The snow retreated, revealing the dark, rich earth beneath. The aspens grew pale green buds, and the streams, swollen with meltwater, sang a boisterous song. It was during this time that the final, deepest chill between the mountain and the town finally melted away. When they went to Clearwater for supplies, the change was palpable. There were no more whispers, no more sideways glances. The eyes that met theirs held not suspicion, but a quiet respect. Men touched the brims of their hats as Logan passed. Women offered Nora shy, genuine smiles. Silas Croft, the mercantile owner, now greeted them with a hearty, "Good day, Mr. and Mrs. McGraw. Their story had become a part of the town's own narrative. A difficult chapter that had, against all odds, ended in a kind of grace. The most profound change came from the Women's Society for Moral Improvement, Mrs. Hemlock remained a bastion of sour disapproval, but her power had been broken. One afternoon, as Nora was speaking with Agnes at the bakery, another woman from the society approached them. Her name was Eleanor Vance, and she had been one of the silent, judging faces in the front row of the town hall. She stood before Nora, twisting the strings of her handbag, her face a mixture of embarrassment and resolve. "Mrs. McGraw," she began, her voice low. I feel I must apologize. On behalf of myself and others in the society." She glanced around, as if to ensure Mrs. Hemlock was not listening. "We saw a situation we did not understand, and we chose the cruelest interpretation. We spoke of propriety when we should have been offering protection. What you endured, and the dignity with which you faced it. It has made many of us question our own Christian charity." Her eyes met Nora's, and for the first time, Nora saw not a judge, but simply another woman. "We were wrong. I am truly sorry." Nora did not know what to say. The apology was a balm on a wound she had not realized was still so tender. "Thank you, Mrs. Vance," she said, her voice quiet. "I accept." Eleanor Vance nodded, a look of immense relief on her face, and then she hurried away. The past had finally been laid to rest, not with anger or retribution, but with a simple, healing admission of truth. Nora had been sent to this place a girl, a passive object in a transaction designed by others. But that girl was gone. In her place was a woman who had chosen. She had chosen to trust, chosen to fight, chosen to love, and chosen to stay. She was the mistress of this mountain, her domain not one of ownership, but of belonging. Logan, too, was a changed man. The silent, solitary giant who had retreated from the world in grief had been drawn back into it. The man who had spoken only in clipped, reluctant phrases now found his voice when it mattered, his quiet words carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. He was no longer just the mountain man. He was Nora's husband, a builder, a pillar of a new kind of community, one founded not on rigid rules, but on mutual respect. One evening in early summer, they sat on the porch of their new home. The air was soft and fragrant with the scent of pine and damp earth. A billion stars glittered in the deep, dark sky, so close it felt as if you could reach up and stir them with your hand. Nora leaned her head against Logan's shoulder, his arm a solid, comforting weight around her. The wooden ring on her finger was warm against her skin. "I was thinking," she said, her voice a soft murmur in the quiet night, "that patch of ground by the creek, where the sun stays longest. I would like to plant an herb garden there, mint and thyme, and lavender, if it will grow." Logan was silent for a moment, and she could feel the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing. "A good place for it," he said finally. "I will build you a fence to keep the deer out." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars. The future was no longer a terrifying, unknown country. It was something they were building together, day by day, choice by choice. "Jedediah was telling me," Nora said, "that the families on the other side of the ridge, their children have no schooling. It is too far for them to travel to town." She paused, then continued, "A new thought taking shape. I was thinking, once the garden is in and the house is fully settled, perhaps we could offer 2 days a week. Maybe they could come here. I could teach them their letters, their numbers." She felt him turn his head to look at her in the starlight. The idea was bold, audacious, to turn their remote sanctuary into a place of learning, a beacon for others, to invite the world in, after they had fought so hard to keep its darkness at bay. He did not answer for a long time. Then he leaned down and pressed his lips to her hair. His voice, when he spoke, was a low, rough whisper. filled with a love that was as vast and as deep as the night sky above them. "Our home will always point outward," he said, "a shelter for those who are lost." She closed her eyes, a feeling of perfect, unassailable peace settling over her. She was not lost anymore. The light from the lamp inside the cabin streamed out through the open window. It did not flicker. It burned with a steady, quiet warmth, a beacon not against a storm, but a promise of welcome. The path up Briar Ridge, once a treacherous track leading to an uncertain fate, was no longer fearsome. It was the way home. Thank you for listening to our story tonight. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.